Welcome back into Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We've been following the U.S. presidential election so closely, but there's another one that just wrapped up, the Iranian presidential election. Let's talk about it a little bit. Reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian won Iran's runoff presidential election on Saturday, besting hardliner Saeed Jalili by promising to reach out to the West and ease enforcement on the country's mandatory headscarf law after years of sanctions and protests squeezing the Islamic Republic. I want to talk a little more about this and what it means for Americans with senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Behnam Ben Taleblu. As always, Behnam, it's good to see you. Welcome in. So a lot to cover as usual. The Associated Press says that Pezeshkian promised no radical changes to Iran's Shiite theocracy in his campaign and long has held Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the final arbiter of all matters of state in the country. So, Behnam, I've seen the reports calling him a reformist, but then you also hear no radical changes. How do you square those two ideas?
Greetings, Austin. Great to be back with you. Listen, style has a substance of its own in the Islamic Republic of Iran, but the reformist faction has largely been pushed away by the population. For the past decade now, the Iranian society has looked at the street as a better way to change things than through the very tightly controlled ballot box. So reformist is a label in name only here. This is someone who has talked about following the Supreme Leader's line. This is someone who has supported the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps at the height of the U.S.-Iran confrontation in 2019 and 2020 when the Trump administration was at the helm. This is someone who is trying to keep the Islamic Republic, that same Shiite theocracy you mentioned that repressed its own citizens and exports its revolution abroad. This is someone who's trying to keep that system afloat in a more skillful manner. And so even though, again, this person doesn't control foreign and security policy, the style and the management that this person may bring to the helm could change things up a little bit. And so Americans have to keep their eyes on the prize here to not fall for the same tried and true tactics of what a allegedly reformist or allegedly moderate candidate may have meant in the past, because unfortunately, Washington has fallen for those traps before, namely in 2013.
And regardless of how you put it here, Pezeshkian will still, no matter what, be challenged by a hardliner government, correct?
Well, Pezeshkian will be able to form a cabinet, but again, we'll have to have people vetted by the ultra-hardline parliament. And again, the presidency is not at all as powerful as the American presidency or the French presidency here. In Iran's political system, the title of Supreme Leader, and that's a person who's 85 years old, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, that's a title meant to be taken rather literally. So he will be checked from all sides here. But it's also worth noting that the reform faction of today is not at all the reform faction that it used to be 10, 15, or even 20 years ago. So there's a real doubt here that we have to be honest about, which is that does this individual, A, have the genuine intention to deliver or even capability to deliver on even the most minute things that he may have promised voters. And certainly when we mention voters, even though the regime affiliated press is talking about near 50% or 1 in 2 participation rate, I find that highly dubious. When in the first round, that was just in late June, you had a record-setting low number for presidential turnout, even using official statistics in the 45-year history of the Islamic Republic.
So I want to ask, as I mentioned at the top, one of the ideas that Pezeshkian is running on is his promise to reach out to the West. What is his idea there? What type of relationship does he feel is needed with the West, or at least what are the words that are coming out of his mouth?
Again, this is a far-flung comment away from what the reform movement used to be when, former President Khatami, who used to be reformist in the late 1990s, talked about a dialogue of civilizations. This is not at all that. This individual has talked about trying to develop ties with every nation in the world except Israel. So that tells you part and parcel of what that individual's foreign policy goals will be. So you'll see much more continuation in the region, much more of the armed export of the revolution, much more of the continued support for terrorism. In fact, Iran's former foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who served on this individual's presidential campaign, talked about being proud of supporting the Palestinians, the Iraqis, and all the myriad Shia militia groups that Iran is materially and financially supporting throughout the Middle East. So that tells you that there is no reform or no change coming to the regime's foreign and security policy. And as for America, our outreach to the West, these are stylistic or ornamental changes, perhaps in the rhetoric coming from one or two individuals in the regime that is designed to ease sanctions pressure. Again, this person has talked about diplomacy or engagement, not as a means to a better political end, but merely as a means to offsetting economic pressure.
So he also talks about easing enforcement on the country's mandatory headscarf law. Can you tell us more about that law and why has it been a focus of this race?
Well, clearly, everything that you've been seeing in this race, even before it was narrowed down to two, and then when it was six, and initially even when 80 candidates registered for the snap presidential election, all of this was happening amid a larger state versus society divide. And you saw that chiefly during the 2022-2023 Women Life Freedom protests that were touched off by the killing of a young 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman named Masoud Pezeshkian, who was beaten brutally to death for allegedly improperly wearing her mandatory headscarf. The regime has actually ramped up enforcement, not just with the physical morality police that is, running across the streets of the country, arresting people, beating people, finding people, but is now transferring part of this enforcement to the digital domain and to the economic domain and to cyber repression. So they may not only harass you and chase you and beat you on the streets and throw the regime's system of injustice at you. They may go after your car, your home, your bank account, and they may actually begin to fine or shut down businesses that serve you.
I've been asking you over the weeks as we've been previewing this election, what are the democratic standards of Iranian elections? And we've been saying that there really aren't any democratic standards. How does a runoff election work? And what are the standards for a runoff? Is it any different looking from the general?
Well, just as a nature of how it relates to the law inside the Islamic Republic, runoffs for these presidential contests do happen. And in fact, 2005, which was a historic runoff that delivered Iran's former populist Holocaust denier-in-chief Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to the presidency in the first round, was the result of a runoff. And they will happen when out of all of the declared candidates, no one will get 50 plus 1% of the vote. So when not one candidate can get up to 50 plus 1% of the vote, they will take the top two highest achieving candidates and move them to the second round or that runoff round. And that's precisely what happened here between late June and early July for this selection rather than election.
You already alluded to this, but we remember voter turnout being low for the general election. How was turnout for the runoff?
So the regime is claiming a number that's daring, 1 in 2 or almost 50% turnout. In my view, this is a gigantic thing that Western analysts, academics, Iran watchers, policymakers, people tapped into social media, people with sources inside Iran need to be pushing back against, because clearly that state versus society divide is there. Clearly, there is not a major re-engagement or embrace of reform by large swaths of the society in general. That same pattern that we've been talking about for weeks past now, where the greater the number of street protests, the less the number of electoral turnout, that trend continues to hold. But here the regime felt the need to make this fib so bold because after the first round of voting set a record low in the 45-year history of the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader of Iran hinted that he would like to see a higher number for the second round. And that's precisely why, in my view, entities like the Ministry of Interior have been cooking the books over time to create this impression of a social groundswell for any candidate, and in general now for Pezeshkian, to A, signal legitimacy, B, bolster deterrence, and C, improve security. Because all the meanwhile during this electoral contest, you've had military officials in the Islamic Republic talking about turnout as not just a political weapon, but as a military tool against their adversaries.
What does our largely American audience need to know about this election?
Things will be status quo, and that Washington and any other major Western capital that does focus on Iran policy should not be taking the bait here. There is likely going to be little to no change, if at all, and even the stylistic changes that this individual may bring in terms of different rhetoric. If there is no major substance change, there should be no major change in U.S. policy. So whether that's the Biden term 2.0 or a Trump term 2.0, Washington needs to be applying maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the people. Because in my view, Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, has been engineering this thing to put lipstick on a pig again, to try to socially engineer less sanctions relief from social engineer more sanctions relief and less pressure from Western capitals, and also trying to divide up the Iranian opposition and diaspora at home. So we should not permit the supreme leader of Iran to get away with that.
All right, Behnam, we appreciate you as always. Take care and have a good rest of your weekend.
You too. Thank you, sir.
All right. Let's slide away for a commercial break. We're back in 2 minutes.